Good boy. Good boy, Bowser. You can see me setting up the camera. You must know. Hello everyone and welcome to my March wrap-up / life update because March was a very interesting month for me. I guess we can start with the life update part because that will inform the books quite a bit. I'll try to put timestamps down below in case you don't care. But I've been on the waiting list to have this surgery for about 6 months and it was finally scheduled in March. Nothing serious. It happened. I'm doing well, but I found out that it was going to happen at the beginning of March and then it happened about mid-March and then I spent the rest of March recovering. So it really weighs on you mentally. You know it's going to be fine. This is a surgery that they do every day, but it's not a fun time. So I think I just really wasn't in a headspace to read. And even after, I was hoping that, you know, having nothing to do all day, being off work, would inspire me to read, but I just wasn't in the right headspace. Part of it was like the drugs that they gave me made me drowsy and sort of foggy where I couldn't focus on reading, and it just wasn't happening. But like I said, we're all good, we're healing up nicely. Don't worry about me, I will be fine. I'm just happy that the surgery happened in a relatively timely manner. I mean, 6 months isn't great, but I got it. So with all of that being said, I read 4 books in March, which is really low. Definitely the lowest since I've started my booktube channel. But you'll also remember that I said that I completed my TBR challenges for March, and I'm gonna stretch the rules slightly, but I had surgery, so give me a break. The one thing that I am going to count is I said that I would read the first day of spring for the prompt asparagus, and I DNF'd it. I tried really hard, but it definitely wasn't a good thing for the headspace that I was in, and not what I wanted it to be. I made it about 70 pages in before DNFing. It turned out to be much more of a sad domestic book than a thriller. Maybe it turns a point eventually, but I wasn't gonna get there. It is also written from the POV of the 8-year-old, which means that the writing is effective because it now sounds like an 8-year-old wrote the book, which I get the intent, but then it made the writing bad as well as like the plot. There was also some fatphobic language that was just sort of hard to read. Like there were a lot, any one thing by itself I could have gotten over, but the culmination of all the stuff just meant it really wasn't for me. And per my TBR rules, DNFs count as long as the book physically leaves my house. So here is proof footage of me leaving it in my little free library. So, one down. I read Finlay, Donovan Knocks Him Dead for my ACTS prompt, and this I really enjoyed. I'm struggling to remember now if I gave it a 4 or a 5, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really good continuation of the first one, just not quite as captivating. Honestly, right now I'm struggling to remember what happens. Do you remember what happened? I remember overarching themes, but it's also hard to remember with what happened in the first book. So that probably means I should knock it down to the 4, but it was really fun. The audiobook narrator is excellent as always. And it's just a good time if you're looking for a slump killer. Finlay Donovan is definitely a good one. Then for my Alpine Green prompt, I ended up reading a Karin Slaughter book with the name False Witness. That was it. This is it was a really interesting book. I was reading a couple of reviews of it and a couple said that this was relatively mild for a Karin Slaughter book. And I don't know how y'all are reading Karin Slaughter because that book was dark. It's a mystery thriller following 2 timelines of these sisters. One is in present timeline a lawyer and the other one has developed like a drug habit. The older one keeps having to get the younger one out of trouble, and you sort of explore their past and why someone might be threatening them. It's a really good book, but it's a tough one to handle. I have just been so foggy. I need to look up what I wrote on Goodreads. Hopefully that will help. The only other thing my review says is that it was overly long, which I definitely agree with. I feel like Karin Slaughter sort of earned her place at this point and isn't getting edited as thoroughly, maybe. Though I think a critique of a couple of the books, well, literally two of the books that I read this month, was that they were overly long, so maybe that's just a me preference thing. And I gave it 4 stars. Then I read a book not for any specific prompt, but because it was the Literally Dead book club pick, merch representing, The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. This is a weird one because I flew through it. I actually really enjoyed the experience of reading it, but I gave it 2 stars. I think ultimately the issue with this is that I came up with things that I think, like, my theories were better than what actually happened in the book, and that's really disappointing. One thing I'm convinced was in an earlier draft of this book and was taken out because it's just so obvious. Like, there's so many clues there, it would fit in so neatly. It blows my mind that it's not in there. This is the story of Jess, who goes to stay with her brother Ben, and he is not at the apartment building when she shows up, and she suspects that something bad has happened to him. One of my other big complaints about this was that it's multi-POV, and so everyone will describe being able to see into other people's apartments, but I never understood the layout of the apartment complex. Like, was it only 5 apartments? But then how can they see into each other from across the courtyard? Were there actually other people living there? Because we never saw any of them. I think I said when I picked this that Lucy Foley is solid, and I think I still agree with that. Like, this is a very easily digestible thriller that was fun to read, but I'll probably never think about it again. It just sort of felt like a missed opportunity. It felt like there were other things you could have done, and we're right there, and then we didn't go for them. The other prompt that I had was Ache, which I was going to read a book that hurt me, but instead I got surgery, so I feel like that should just count. I think that the prompts should be able to fit for books or activities. Oblige me, I'm taking this one. And then the final book that I read this month, all 4 of them, was Middlegame by Seanan McGuire. This I was reading for the Baked Alaska prompt, and this was a very strange reading experience. I didn't write a Goodreads review for this just because I don't know how to talk about this book. I feel like we might be here a minute, so I'm just gonna prop. Seanan McGuire is very much no plot, just vibes. A very mild version of that, but it is much more beautiful writing, the feelings, than it is concise plot. And I think that that works much better in a Wayward Children under 200 pages kind of book. It doesn't work very well in a 528 page book because it's a lot of the same sort of scene over and over again and a vague magic sense that doesn't progress. I feel like I'm going to explain this very poorly, so forgive me. But so this is basically what I said in my TBR. It is the story of Roger and Dodger, who are twins, who were created by Reed, is the alchemist, and they are supposed to help him ascend to godhood. But none of that is really explained, the mechanics of how that works, which I think is fine, except that the book kind of tried to have it both ways, where it was cool, unexplained magic, but also tried to start explaining it. And I'm sorry you can't have it both ways. It either needs to be vaguely magical or I need, like, science. I need a firm explanation of it, and that just didn't work for me. I'm fine with, like, an ambiguous magic system, an open ending, but I'm not fine with you pretending that you told us any real information or solved it. The one thing that disappointed me with this was I think that the beginning and the end were really strong. And those were both of the parts that featured Reed. Reed is basically not existent for most of the book, and it sort of just turns into a contemporary. A fine contemporary. I didn't have any problems with it other than it being overly long. Sorry if you can hear my husband talking. He's doing his own thing. But Reed really helped to bridge the gap to make this more of a fantasy sci-fi novel than the contemporary where it's just Roger and Dodger. He had, like, the magic council and stuff, and we do a lot more flipping back and forth in the beginning and the end, but he's not existent in the middle, and the vibe then doesn't track. I feel like I'm being harsh, but I gave it 4 stars because I think that the story here is really interesting. I just wish that it had been told in a slightly different way, but I'm still happy to get to read this story. One thing that I've heard a lot of other people talk about is how they love Roger and Dodger and they're the best characters ever. But I always sort of had a problem, especially with Roger. Most of it is from Roger's POV, which his POV was fine. I just wish it had felt more equal between him and Dodger, because I think Dodger is the more interesting character. Maybe that's just me. But Roger always felt sort of distant. Like, he talked about how much he loved Dodger and would never hurt her and stuff, but it always felt cold or clinical or something. It just I didn't feel the emotion behind it. I did do a good chunk of this on audio, like maybe half. The audiobook narrator is fantastic, like one of the best ones I've ever heard. I hesitate to say that, but she was incredible. And I do find when doing an audiobook that emotion doesn't necessarily come through as well. So maybe that's a me thing that you wouldn't experience if you read it purely with your eyeballs. I think it's a really interesting take. I just don't know that it necessarily worked for me. It felt Starless Sea adjacent, which feels blasphemous to say because I'm not a Starless Sea gal, but I feel like a lot of what I said is also applicable to the Starless Sea, that like it's a vague magic system that tries to explain it a bit too much and should have just kept it vague, and that the tone changes quite a bit throughout, that you go from pure real world to pure like magical library. It's got all of that beautiful writing, and I do think like this is more my speed. It just didn't have to be this much. It's too long. It's a lot of the same conflict over and over again, and you can see it coming, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff in here. There's like a twist around the halfway mark that I thought was really cool, but then I thought the twist was going to do something and then it didn't. This is another one where like I like my explanation more than what the book actually did. It was just a weird month for me. Let's just call it 4 stars and call it a day. I don't know how I managed to talk that long for only 4 books, but I did it. If you stuck around with me, thank you. I appreciate you, though I do judge you. But April's here. It's already shaping up to be a much better reading month. I'm really enjoying what I'm reading. It'll be more than 4. I can virtually promise you it'll be more than 4. That's it. Thank you so much for joining me and him and we, or at least I, will see you very soon in another video.